Hi, I'm Wally, and in this video today we're going to be looking at the extremely exciting product, the NEVER-FILL worm bin. The NEVER-FILL worm bin was based on the research and the book Organic Growing with Worms by David Murphy, and this book has got a lot of information on worm farming, commercial worm farming, and all the recipes and the do's and the don'ts when it gets to earthworm and the whole process with earthworm farming. In this video we'll be looking at what all is included in the NEVER-FILL worm bin. We'll give you also a bit of background on how we developed this bin to the point where this product is now. We'll also show you the recipe in starting off the system and the right way of introducing your worms into the NEVER-FILL worm bin. And we'll give you some tips and do's and don'ts on what you should include in the worm bin and what not. The NEVER-FILL worm bin is designed so that you can reduce your own carbon footprint, and all the organic waste that we're generating in our homes, which currently is going to the landfill site, that in a green and a responsible way we're recycling that so that we can reintroduce it into our gardens and use it to grow our own vegetable garden, so that we can bring back all that organic material into the soil in a very healthy and responsible way. So let's start off with looking at what is included in our NEVER-FILL worm bin. So basically our NEVER-FILL worm bin has got 5 main components. Firstly, it's our NEVER-FILL worm bin itself, which is a wooden construction, and it's got air vents both on the front and at the rear of the bin. Secondly, we've got our worm tea pan, which captures all the worm tea generated by the worms, and a convenient little drain tap so that we can drain that worm tea off and mix it with water and pour it over our vegetable garden with all that rich nutrients. Thirdly is an underfelt, a carpet underfelt segment, and this serves a lot of purposes, but mainly insulation, that we stabilize the temperatures, that we stop a moisture loss in our worm bin, and then lastly is to stop all insects and flies laying eggs and larvae into the bin, and you might sit with a maggot problem. This little underfelt comes inside the worm bin on top of where we introduce the food to insulate that layer off. Fourthly is our lid. It's also a wooden lid, nice and strong, and you can see that it's aerated as well because we want to bring in a lot of oxygen into this bin. Got air gaps, but small enough that we don't have flies and other insects that can get through it. And this fits nice and snug on top of our NEVER-FILL worm bin. And then lastly, our 5th component obviously is a bucket full of earthworms, so that we can start off this process and get the earthworms to start getting happy and multiplying within our earthworm bin. Let's look at the construction of the bin a bit. As I mentioned, there's some big air gaps because we want to have a lot of movement of air going through this bin, and that's based both on the front and the rear side of the bin. Because what we want to try and avoid is that this bin goes anaerobic, in other words with a loss of oxygen, because then it starts smelling and rotting. So we've got a lot of airflow going through this bin, both from front and rear and through the lid. But the clever part which we've done is we've lined it with a shade cloth material, which is basically this cloth, very, very strong. It's got a 90% blockage, but it allows enough oxygen to go through. And the main reason for that is you don't want other insects and flies to get in here and lay eggs, and then you've got a maggot problem in your worm bin. So that we've lined up here, and you can see at the bottom, this now allows you for when your vermicast is ready to actually lift it and harvest out all our rich nutrient vermicast soil that we've generated with the worm bin. Very importantly, with the felt layer, I've mentioned to you some main functions. Insulation is a very important one. We did some temperature logs where we looked at the temperature loss and the changes in temperature in the worm bin, because that's very important. We want to try and keep this environment as stable as we can. And with some temperature loggers, we did one outside for ambient temperature, one inside the bin to check the temperatures there, and then we put a logger underneath the felt on the soil to see how that felt contributes to stabilizing that temperature. And what we found is that the ambient temperature outside, a big range, there you're looking at a delta T change of 12 degrees during the day. where in the morning it's quite cold and in the afternoon quite hot, and there's a big fluctuation in temperature. But inside the bin, because wood is quite a good insulation material, we found that temperature difference drops down to 8 degrees. So from 12 degrees outside, 8 degrees inside. So that big change, we've stabilized it a bit more. And then under the felt, it brought it down to 5 degrees. So that's a much more cozier environment and temperature stable environment. So you don't have that big variation in temperature under that felt. It helps that you insulate that layer and keep the temperature a bit more stable. Also what it does, it stops the drying of that soil, because our earthworms, they need about an 80% moisture environment because they breathe through their skin. They don't populate in the soil if it's not well moistened and protected. So that layer also helps that we don't have drying of our NEVER-FILL-WORMBIN bin as well. And then the last function of the felt, as I mentioned, the insects, it keeps that, if there's anything that might get through the lid or the sides, that it actually can't get into the soil, because we don't want flies and other maggots and stuff in our little worm bin. So let me show you how we're going to start off the bin and what we need to do to make our worms nice and comfortable in their new little home. So the process of preparing our NEVER-FILL worm box or introducing our worms is basically we're going to be giving them a bedding layer. The bedding layer can be something like straw or grass, which has got a lot of air movement in it as well, and it gives the worms a dry environment to move into if you might have some rain or some big temperature differences. The other option is that you can use some shredded paper. Some shredded newspaper works well, and you want to do that layer at the bottom about 50 millimeters high is the ideal height to do that bedding material. The other option is if you've got some fresh horse manure, some stable manure which has got a lot of straw and stuff in there as well, anything grassy that can give that bedding and air movement. It's important when you start off the bin to have that bedding layer at the bottom of the bin. As that worm bin starts working and starts producing vermicast, that organic layer will start dissolving and turning into a rich, dark, loomy soil. So it's basically just the first step to start off the bin is we want that bedding layer into the bin. So what we'll do now is show you how we're going to put that bedding material in to get the worms nice and comfy. Then on top of that, we're going to put the worms that you'll get with the bin. You're going to put that on top of the bin so that they can start populating that area. And then on top of that, we'll put them their first batch of some food scraps. You can use some cardboard or scrap paper that will shred up and give them their first food layer. So this is the stacking bin system. The stacking bin system, as it says, basically is a whole lot of bins that you stack on top of one another as the worms process that food waste that you've given them. So the bottom bin is a bin that captures all the worm tea, and usually you can have a little tap here to drain it off. What I did is I made some holes in it to drain that water out of the bins. You can see here's a row of 8 bins, and as the bin fills up, you then introduce a second bin which the worms then move through, and as you can see, that's the construction of the bin with a whole lot of holes in there that the worms move through those bins into the next ones. The problems that I've had with these bins is obviously they're quite heavy. You need 2 people to lift them to harvest off that vermicast, and as soon as you lift it, it gets extremely messy because all that soil falls on the floor, and what happens, although the worms do move through, a lot of the worms stay behind in the bins, and it's always a challenge to get that worms out of that bottom bin as well. Some of the other problems, which is quite sad, you can see here some dead and dried worms on the side. The worms do find their way through the side of the bin still. And in the same way, you also have other insects that get into the bins as well. So those are some of the challenges that I found with the stacking bin system. This system, you can see the top, it's also got the felt that I've explained to you, and I use this bins for the cultivation of the worms. I only use horse manure because it's clean and it has no smell, and the horse manure is one of your most effective ways to get the worms to populate quite quickly. So these are my cultivation bins that I use for breeding the worms quite quickly, and then introduce them into the system that works a bit better. The second system is the one in a compost heap, which I'll show you in a moment, and that's where the concept of the NEVER-FILL worm bin started, where you harvest off the vermicast at the bottom and introduce your new material at the top. Let's have a look at that quickly. Okay, so this is the compost bin system. You can basically see it's a container which is 2 meters in length, by 1 meter wide, by 1 meter deep, and there's 2 of them. What I've also done is I've put a PVC layer at the bottom to try and stop the roots of the trees and everything getting into the worm bin as well, and the insects. This bin works extremely effective for introducing your garden waste and garden clippings, because you introduce everything at the top and you harvest out at the bottom as it does. Also see the felt layer, which I've put at the top as well, and it just helps to insulate it, keep the moisture in, and then at the bottom you then just harvest out your rich vermicast material, ideal to introduce into the garden. The challenge with this system, what I found, is you do lose a lot of that rich nutrient worm tea out into the garden, because it's difficult to capture that up. But the concept of introduce at the top, harvest at the bottom worked brilliantly. Let me now show you the commercial bins that I built, improving on this whole system of the NEVER-FILL worm bin. So these are the commercial worm bins that I built out of brick and mortar, and you can see it is basically a meter by a meter size by a meter deep bin, and it is designed so that you also fill at the top and can harvest out at the bottom. This was the third phase of our development. One of the lessons we learned here was how important is aeration. We inserted a pellet on the side to help us with that airflow and to keep that soil very oxygenated. And then what you do is at the bottom you then harvest out your completed vermicast product. The challenge with this is obviously it's a very expensive way to build it. As you can see as well, the runoff of the worm tea, quite difficult to capture that as well. And also what we found is that you've got the birds coming and picking off the worms as quite a bit of a problem as well.